You've felt it before. You're having a conversation with someone and you just can't figure them out. Not because they're being difficult, not because they're hiding something obvious, just because something about them doesn't give itself away easily. And you walk away thinking about them longer than you expected to. That's not a mystery. That's psychology. And here's what nobody tells you. People who are hard to read aren't doing it on purpose. They're not playing games. They're not holding back to seem more interesting. They operate according to a specific inner architecture that most people have never consciously understood. And today, we're going to break every single part of it and down. Here's what most people generally get wrong about people who are hard to read. They think these people are hiding something. They think they're deliberately concealing themselves, carefully managing what they reveal and what they keep to themselves. But that's not what's happening at all. People who are hard to read aren't hiding. They're simply not performing. And in a world where most people are constantly sending signals, constantly broadcasting, constantly managing their image, the absence of that performance feels like a wall. It's not a wall, it's just stillness. And stillness, it turns out, is one of the rarest things a person can have. Research on social perception has found that people who are hard to read are consistently rated as more intelligent, more trustworthy, and more compelling by the people around them. Not because they engineered that impression, but because depth, real depth, has a quality that performance never will. Here are 7 traits that make certain people genuinely hard to read. Quick pause. I recently launched this channel to explore human psychology, behavior, and the hidden mechanisms behind social interactions. We're still at the very beginning, so every subscription really means a lot. If this kind of content helps you better understand people and the way the human mind works, consider subscribing. It really helps me continue and create even more in-depth videos. Thank you, and let's continue. 1. They don't fill silence with noise. The first trait that makes people hard to read is also the simplest. They are comfortable with silence in a way that most people are not. Most people treat silence like an emergency. The moment a conversation pauses, they rush to fill it. They offer opinions they haven't fully formed yet. They ask questions they don't actually want the answers to. They perform ease because the silence itself makes them uneasy. People who are hard to read don't do that. They let the silence settle. They let a question land before they answer it. They let a moment breathe before moving to the next one. And that stillness, that refusal to perform comfort, creates something in the people around them that is almost magnetic. Psychologists who study conversational dynamics have found that the ability to tolerate silence without anxiety is one of the strongest markers of psychological security. It signals that a person doesn't need the conversation to validate them. They were fine before it started. They'll be fine when it ends. And that quality, that self-containment, is deeply hard to read because everything most people use to get a read on someone, the nervous energy, the over-explaining, the need to be liked, is simply not there. You can't get a read on someone who isn't broadcasting anything. And people who are comfortable with silence almost never are. 2. Their face doesn't announce what they're thinking. People who are hard to read have often developed, usually without choosing to, a resting expression that gives very little away. Not a cold expression, not a blank one. Just one that doesn't immediately telegraph every passing thought and feeling the way most people's faces do without them even realizing it. Most people are far more readable than they know. Their face reacts before their mind has decided how to respond. Their micro-expressions confirm what their words are trying to deny. Their eyes move in directions their mouth would never go. People who are hard to read have, over time, developed a kind of internal processing that happens before the expression rather than alongside it. They feel things deeply. They react internally to almost everything. But that reaction completes itself inside before it reaches their face. Research on emotional expressivity study has found that people with lower baseline facial expressivity are consistently perceived as more mysterious, more controlled, and more authoritative than those with high expressivity, regardless of what they're actually feeling. In other words, a face that shows less emotion isn't a face with no emotion. It's just more contained. And contained, when it's genuine rather than performed, communicates something that expressiveness almost never does. That what's happening inside is real enough that it doesn't need to be announced. 3, they respond rather than react. This is the quality that people find most disorienting about people who are hard to read, and it's the one that reveals the most about what's actually happening beneath the surface. Most people react, something happens, and their response is immediate, visible, and directly proportional to the trigger. Someone says something provocative and their face shifts. Someone challenges them and they go on the defensive. Someone flatters them and they light up in a way that makes it obvious the flattery landed. People who are hard to read do something different. They pause, not because they're calculating, not because they're suppressing, but because something in them processes what just happened before deciding what to do with it. Psychologists call this response flexibility, and research on emotional regulation has found it to be one of the strongest predictors of psychological maturity. The person who can receive a piece of information, sit with it for a moment, and then choose how to respond rather than simply reacting to it is operating from a fundamentally different place than most people around them. And that pause, that almost invisible gap between what happens and how they respond, is one of the things that makes them so genuinely hard to read, because their response is never automatic. And when you can't predict someone's response, you can't predict them. And when you can't predict them, you can't stop thinking about them. Let's stop here, because before we go any further, something needs to be said. If people have often told you that you're hard to read, hard to reach, or hard to understand, I want you to listen closely. What people have been calling your mystery is not a barrier you built to keep people out. It's the natural result of being someone whose inner life is richer and more complex than what shows on the surface. You're not withholding. You're not cold. You're not emotionally unavailable. You're simply someone who doesn't perform. And in a world that rewards performance above almost everything else, that's going to confuse people. Let them be confused. Stay with me. 4, they don't volunteer information about themselves. And this isn't about privacy. It's about something far more interesting than that. People who are hard to read aren't secretive in the suspicious sense. They'll answer questions honestly. They'll engage authentically. They'll open up when the moment calls for it and when the trust is there to support it. What they won't do is offer information unprompted just to fill space, just to seem relatable, just to give the other person something to hold on to. Most people in a new conversation or a social situation that feels slightly uncomfortable instinctively start sharing about themselves, their opinions, their past, their preferences. They do it because self-disclosure creates the feeling of connection, and the feeling of connection reduces the discomfort of uncertainty. People who are hard to read don't have that same need. They're comfortable being unknown to someone for longer than most people can tolerate being unknown. They don't need you to have a clear picture of them in order to feel okay in the conversation. Research on self-disclosure and social bonding has found that while sharing accelerates the feeling of closeness, it also accelerates judgment. People who share less give others less material to categorize, less to dismiss, less to be judged on before they've had the chance to be fully understood. The result is that people who are hard to read stay genuinely open longer. Not because they engineered that effect, but because they never gave anyone enough information to close the book on them. 5, they're equally at ease in any social setting. People who are hard to read have an unusual quality that most people notice without being able to name. They seem comfortable in almost any environment, at ease in serious conversations and light ones, present in formal settings and informal ones, never visibly performing the version of themselves that the room seems to expect. Most people shift. They have a work self and a home self. A self they perform with strangers, and a self they relax into with people they trust. And those shifts are visible: the slightly different posture, the slightly different vocabulary, the slightly different laugh. People who are hard to read don't shift in the same way, not because they're identical in every context, but because their core doesn't change based on who's watching. They bring the same essential self to every room, adjusted at the edges but unchanged at the center. Psychologists describe this as a strong sense of identity, a stable and consistent internal sense of who you are that doesn't depend on external context for definition. And research consistently links it to psychological resilience, lower social anxiety, and the kind of quiet self-assurance that other people find simultaneously calming and impossible to fully figure out. And that consistency, that groundedness, is one of the deepest reasons certain people remain genuinely hard to read. No matter how long you've known them. 6, they listen more than they talk. And this one might seem simple, but what's actually happening when people who are hard to read listen is far more complex than it appears. They're not just being quiet, they're paying attention fully, actively, with the kind of focused presence that most people only manage in rare moments. They're tracking not just what you're saying, but how you're saying it. The words you choose, the ones you avoid, the moments where your energy shifts. And because they're genuinely paying attention rather than waiting for their turn, they rarely give themselves away in conversation. They're not revealing their opinions before they've fully formed them. They're not reacting before they've fully understood. They're gathering, integrating, making sense of things at a level that doesn't show on the surface. Research on listening behavior has found that people perceived as exceptional listeners are also consistently perceived as more trustworthy and harder to read than average, not because they're withholding, but because genuine attention has no tells. It doesn't announce itself the way performance does. It simply is. And when you're having a conversation with someone who is genuinely listening rather than pretending to listen, something shifts. You feel it. You start talking more than you intended to. You find yourself saying things you hadn't planned to say. And afterward, you realize you know very little about them, but you feel somehow that they know a great deal about you. 7, their depth only shows when it's needed. And this is the quality that ties everything else together. People who are hard to read are not shallow people who have learned to seem mysterious. They are deep people who have learned, or perhaps simply never unlearned, that depth doesn't need to be displayed to be real. Most people perform their depth. They reference their complexity in conversation. They volunteer their emotional awareness. They signal their intelligence, their sensitivity, and their inner life in ways that make those qualities immediately visible and immediately available for assessment. People who are hard to read carry their depth quietly. It doesn't appear in their resting expression or their casual conversation or even their default social mode. It appears in the moments when it's truly needed. When something real is happening and the situation demands more than surface level engagement. And in those moments, what comes out of them surprises people because it doesn't match the image most people had constructed. It's richer, warmer, more attuned to what the moment actually required than anyone expected from someone who had given so little away before. Their most significant qualities in response to genuine need, rather than in performance of themselves, are consistently rated as more trustworthy and more authentically connected than those who signal their qualities from the start. Because depth that reveals itself when it's actually needed is the only kind of depth that can't be faked. And that, more than the silence, more than the stillness, more than the face that gives nothing away, is the deepest reason certain people remain genuinely, lastingly, and compellingly hard to read. If someone in your life has always been hard to read, you now know what's actually happening beneath that. They're not withholding themselves from you. They're not playing a game. They're not trying to seem interesting. They're simply people whose inner life is full enough that it doesn't need the outside world to confirm it. People whose sense of themselves doesn't depend on feeling understood by everyone they meet. People who have learned, or perhaps always known, that the most real things about a person are the ones that take the longest to see. People who are hard to read have been misunderstood for most of their lives. Called distant, called cold, called difficult, made to feel like the fact that they don't perform themselves for easy consumption is somehow a failure of character. But psychology tells a different story. Being hard to read often means your inner life is more complex than what your surface can contain. It means your responses are considered rather than automatic. It means your depth is real rather than performed. It means you are still, despite everything this world does to reward people who make themselves immediately legible, operating from a place of genuine self-possession. That is not something to apologize for. That is something to understand. If this video put words to something you've always known about yourself, but never quite been able to explain, subscribe for more psychology content that goes deep into how people actually work, and leave a comment. Have people always told you that you're hard to read? And did you ever think that was a flaw? I'll be waiting for you in the comments.